Ladies and gentlemen, on today's episode, making his 2024 return to the show, we have our good friend, the aquatic biologist, Mr. Shan O'Gorman. Today, we have Shan on to talk about the life cycle, the reproduction, color patterns, behavior, and overall importance of bluegill. So, Shan has decades of experience managing ponds and managing small lakes, and today, we pick his brain about one of our favorite fish's favorite snacks. All that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
Welcome to the Tackle Talk podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. World-class fishing gear, unmatched personal service. Now, here's your host, Andrew Hayes.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another very special episode of the Tackle Talk podcast. As always, we are brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. And folks, right now, this is not a drill. American Legacy Fishing is doing 20% off site-wide now through February 9th. And all you have to do is use code LOYALTY20, LOYALTY20. And you have over a full week to take advantage of this offer and this sale right now. 20% off whatever you need. The only exclusions are Loomis, Dobbins, Humminbird, Garmin, Minn Kota, Powerhouse Lithium, and sale items. Used gear is already marked 20% off, but you'll notice there's a lot of brands on that list that are not excluded, many of which that are normally excluded. So some that start with an S, some that start with an M, wink, wink, nod, nod. There's a lot of things on sale right now that aren't normally on sale. All you have to do is use code LOYALTY20 over at www.americanlegacyfishing.com, plus all of your favorites that I am allowed to say out loud: Berkeley, Beast Coast, 13, Abu Garcia. They just got their full line of Fenwicks in. So if you've been eyeing one of those new Fenwick rods, boom, 20% off. If you need line, you need to restock on spools from Sunline or Seagar, whatever you need, boom, another 20% off. It's like having Black Friday all over again, except there are less exclusions. And as a bonus for you lefties out there, we always get told that we leave out the lefties on these sales. Right now, ALF has a killer sale on left-handed bait casters. The Shimano SLX MGL 70 they have on sale for $99.99. You heard that right. Usually, the Shimano SLX MGL 70 is normally $150. Right now, they have left-handed models available for $99.99. A killer budget-friendly reel if you want a reel that can handle that workload of a normal reel while also playing nice with finesse baits. So head over to www.americanlegacyfishing.com. And for this week, forget Tackle Talk 10. All you need to know is code LOYALTY20, LOYALTY20, gets you 20% off basically everything on the website. So go check them out, www.americanlegacyfishing.com, and use code LOYALTY20. All right, folks, today we have a gentleman that needs no introduction, partly because this is his fifth time on the show, and you're going to hear his familiar voice. It is our old friend, aquatic biologist, Shan O'Gorman. And in the past, we've had Shan on for a variety of episodes. We had him on for everything from the very first episode, getting to know his past and his fisheries management experience, to more in-depth shows about pond stocking and maintenance, to episode 1 of the Bait Breakdown, where we talked about anything and everything bait fish. Shan has literally shared hours and hours and hours of his experience with us on this show over the years. But if you listen closely to some of those older episodes, it's really clear that Shan has a particular appreciation for a specific species and a specific type of forage, and that is bluegill. So I asked Shan to come back on today to give us a crash course on maybe the most prevalent species of bass forage across the country, but also one of the most overlooked. But today, we give the bluegill the respect they deserve as we break down everything from growth rates to patterns and behaviors to their importance for growing big bass. So with that, we're going to get right into our conversation with Shan O'Gorman. All right, ladies and gentlemen, today is your lucky day. I swear some of you listen to this show and wake up every Tuesday just hoping that you hit the lottery, and this guy is our guest. He's been on for 5 times, I think now. It is the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Shan O'Gorman. Shan, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you for having me on. I think it is the 5th time.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, you are more than twice as frequent as our next closest guest that's been on multiple times. So you are now, I think we've only had people on a max of 2 times so far for everybody except you. So yeah, you're in uncharted tackle talk territory here.
I'm dominating the field.
But you are, I mean, you're one of my favorites. You're one of everybody's favorites because these are the episodes we love where we really get to sit down and, you can bring a pro on and you can talk about, what line they like to throw a jerk bait on or something, but really sitting down and trying to understand the biology, understand the science, understand some little nugget of information that might help us understand either the fish or the forage that we spend countless hours out there on the water trying to either imitate or catch. So I'm really excited for this one. I think today I wanted to have you on because I really want to focus on a 100% bluegill episode. And I think in my mind, that means like the life cycle of a bluegill, the growth rate of bluegill, and what could impact the growth rate of a bluegill for someone, like me versus someone down like you. I think there's a lot of variables there. And, really just this species of bream that I've heard you talk for years now, saying that it is like the protein, supplement for bass, right? If you're trying to grow big trophy bass, I think you've been pretty adamant that there's nothing better than a pure bluegill to do that. So I think I'm really excited to jump into bluegill with you today, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, man. Look forward to it. Actually, I have a lot of experience with it in many different ways. I've been very fortunate to manage ponds for years now. And in pond management, and we can actually really in small lakes too, anything 1,000 acres and under, you really have to get into some really big bodies of water before bluegill isn't the most important forage fish. Certainly the one that you want to see in, say, like an electrofishing survey. If you were hired as a biologist, which part of my job for many years was this, hey, come to my pond and do a fish survey. And make sure the proper species of fish, right? And you can start right there, actually, with it. That's a great place because people misunderstand what that even means. Like the pond stocking idea is all man-made. It's all been studied in college. There's a guy back, Homer Swingle was his name. He was at Auburn almost 100 years ago now, probably 80 years ago now. And he stocked different ponds with different species of sunfish. As you said, brim, you can kind of group them all together. There's so many different kinds depending on what part of the country you're in, and they did studies. They literally all right, you stock this with this and what happens, and that with that and what happens. And these guys back in 30s, 40s, he was the father of pond and lake management, basically, with these studies by seeing which species of fish interact best together in ponds. Because back then there was this huge initiative, especially like around in Georgia, where I'm from, a lot of ponds. There's 1 million ponds literally in Georgia that were all built by the state of Georgia back in like the 40s and 50s for erosion control purposes. If you had land, you could get a pond built for free. So that was a big part of what drove my pond management business being in Georgia, was the fact that we had all those state-built ponds all those years ago,
I think I love the bluegill part of this too, because you just hinted that it's the great equalizer, where it's like you go to every body of water. Yes, some of them are going to have shad, some of them are going to have green sunfish, some of them are going to have crappie or specks or whatever you call them, depending on where you live. But almost every body of water is going to have bluegill or some form of bluegill in it. Now, is it the main forage? Is it a secondary forage or a third, source for them? That kind of depends on the body of water you're in, but almost every body of water across the country that you're fishing that has a healthy bass population has bluegill in it somewhere. So it's part of the equation anywhere.
Yes.
Now you could be at
Everywhere.
100%, bluegill pond like you're talking about, and then it is the whole equation, or you could be like me and we could go to the river down the street from my house. Are there a ton of bluegill in it? No, but they're definitely in there and they play a part.
Absolutely. And that brings up a great point. Like, where are you fishing for these fish? A river to a pond, that's, completely different environments. But when we're talking in the pond environment, small lake environment, I would strongly advise any fisherman to learn to recognize how to positively identify bluegill. You don't have to really learn to identify all the other species of fish, but learn to identify the bluegill and learn to recognize where you have a good diverse population of bluegill, because the special thing about bluegill is they spawn so often. They spawn more often than all the other species of sunfish, all their cousins and relatives and everything, by a long margin. And so where you have a population that's, say, skewed higher towards bluegill, you have a population, a forage base that's skewed higher to be able to produce more forage for your predatory fish, because they can spawn so much more. And where you see problems in ponds, like we can use our small ponds and our forage only ponds. Like I've experienced this in my career many times. And like we talked about kind of in the green room right now, I have a pond we're talking about in real time. I've been growing the fish. I stocked them. They're 4 to 5 inch bass last May. It's 2.5 acre pond. It's bluegill only. The bluegill are on a feeder. So when the bluegill take the feed, that makes them heavier than they would be naturally if they were just not fed in the pond. And since the bluegill are heavier, the bass get heavier, right? Because what they're eating is heavier. But that being said, it's a bluegill only fishery. It's a bluegill only forage base, mostly 90%, 95% probably. But we have bass in 2 seasons over 4 pounds. Okay, because
That's
when
insane.
a bass eats a bluegill, okay, even though it's not a diverse fishery of all these other species of fish, what happens is a bass eats a bluegill. There's so much recruitment, there's so much spawning by the other bluegill that are left, that when one bluegill is removed, another one is replaced. Right now, you can take the same pond, or you can take many of the other ponds that I've seen, right? Maybe it has a stream coming in and you've got this pond set up like this, and you've got this exceptional growth. But over like a 3, 4, 5, 6 year period where other fish species are coming in from a stream, it starts changing because the amount of fish that can live in the pond is limited. So the more crappie, the more green sunfish, the more pumpkin seeds, the more orange spotted sunfish, the more whatever else comes into that pond, it's taking away from the bluegill. And those other sunfish species, no matter what they are not spawning as good as a bluegill. So you have a diversity of fish species in there, but just because it's diverse doesn't mean it's more productive. It's actually less productive.
Yeah, we tend to, just me, dumb angler guy, I just tend to group all of those sunfish. Anything that looks remotely like a bluegill, ever since you were this high, you just called them bluegill. They might be reddy or they might be green sunfish, you can tell the difference of. But some of those other subspecies that look very much like a gill, just with, a different color behind the little gill plate back here. Or it's interesting to think that just the physical differences aren't it. Those fish could only be spawning once a year, if that, and a bluegill could be spawning a handful of times a year. And like you said, just the replenishment of that pure bluegill species is what gets a bass. Incredible to think about a 2-year-old bass being 4 pounds. I've got 8, 9-year-old fish around here that are struggling to get to 4 pounds. Right.
And what another great point that we can use right there too, and with our small ponds example, okay, we could stock, say, threadfin shad into the pond. And we did stock threadfin shad in the pond. They didn't take, but I think it was because I have a really low water hardness. Something they didn't take for whatever reason. We don't have any shad, but obviously a water quality issue of some kind. Anyway, if we had bluegill and threadfins like we had intended, our bass wouldn't have grown any larger. I'd still have bass at about 4.1 pounds. Okay. By diversifying the forage base, I'm not increasing the forage base. And that's where a lot of guys get confused.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's what I'm talking about. Could I diversify the forage base with, say, bluegill and thread fins and maybe get a little extra out of it? Yeah, maybe that combination of fish, possibly. But bluegill and some other species of fish, generally no. You're generally greatly reducing the productivity, especially in your pond where your space is very limited. It's not a big lake. You don't have a lot of space. You don't have a lot of fish.
So let's start with, because you mentioned the spawning rate of a bluegill is obviously like one of its big selling points. Let's start with the actual spawn of the bluegill itself and just trying to understand the timeline here and what we're working with, like when a bluegill is reproducing. So I think around here, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we seem to see like June be just prime bluegill spawn time. They move into those old beds and they come up and you just see like the bluegill all over the place up shallow. So when a bluegill is spawning, and that's like the first time of year that we're seeing those bluegills spawn, when that activity starts, what does that timeline look like? Like how long do you typically see them moving into a bed? How long does it take to actually do the spawn and gestation? And then how long for those eggs to hatch?
Generally you'll start seeing it. It's like the mid 60s, it's a little bit warmer. It's a little bit later. Like you said, depending on where you are, you might be June where you get your mid to high 60s. It could be down here. It could be completely different. So, where you are in the country matters. But generally once you get the bluegill spawning, they will spawn on a monthly cycle. But if it gets too hot, they will shut down. Right. So if you go up to like, 90 high, mid to high 90-degree water temperatures, you're going to lose a bluegill spawn on those seasons and those hot, like August parts of the year. Right. So that's also too, as a pond manager, something you have to be aware of. It's already happened to us at the pond. Like the first season, we had more bluegill spawns the first season because the summer was much milder than the second season.
Yeah.
Because the summer was much hotter.
Is there anything you can do to that pond to help keep temperature down?
Not really, because you're really talking about, the weather. You're talking about a period of time over a 6-week period of time was really hot and the fish were just stressed and they weren't biting and it was just miserable. And, it is what it is with the weather.
Or like when you're building a pond, like, is it better to have more depth? Is it better to have more tree cover on the side or something? Is there anything you can do to help?
You certainly want shade. You certainly want depth. You don't have to go crazy with any of that stuff. Especially in ponds, like, that 8 to 10 feet of depth is plenty for a pond. You don't have to, if you start digging it out to like 30 feet, it really won't have too much oxygen down there in a pond. The light can't penetrate that deep. So, it really depends on the type of the pond and where you're at, but fish are very adaptive. Like you just don't necessarily, I've seen bass, especially bass and bluegill, especially just basic ponds. They can adapt and live in very shallow environments or they're very tough, very tough.
You see gills in 6 inches of water, like,
right?
They stay there all year. Like, I mean, you go in the wintertime, they're sitting in 6 inches of water. I don't know how they're doing it. You look in the summertime, they're sitting in 6 inches of water. Like, those fish don't move, it seems like.
Dude, a couple of years ago, I've got a blade bait at Lake Lanier, fishing with a buddy of mine. Hadn't been fishing with my buddy Mickey in forever. He's like, let's go fishing. I'm like, okay, cool. So we go to the lake. I got my spinning tackle, literally vertical jigging a blade bait at 45 feet of water. Tap, get a bite, whack, pull it. It's a freaking 8-inch bluegill in 45 feet of water.
That dude ain't seen the sunshine in years.
I was like, what are you doing in 45 feet of water? Now, it was like, January or some, weird time of year. But still, yeah, like, what are you doing down there?
So when they are spawning and the eggs get laid and then they hatch, obviously, I think I've read somewhere before, they don't just hatch and they're just like free swimming little bluegills going around, right? Like they're like these little blobs almost that are just basically stuck to the bottom of the nest, and then the male, I think, has to guard them for a certain number of days before they're viable enough to sort of
Correct.
go out on their own, right?
Yeah, it's a whole process. Like you can get an entire degree in all that. You know what I mean? Like it's a whole entire world into itself. But that's what's important. On your ponds, especially, it's important, how to identify that big mature male bluegill has that dominant forehead, uses that darker kind of purple, almost black colored bluegill. It's important to return those to your ponds, because that bigger, larger male is better protection for those nests.
That's an interesting caveat to bluegill versus bass. And bass, we're so protective of the spawning females, where it's like, put that fish back. You want its, genetics back in the water. It sounds like bluegill are the polar opposite.
Well, that's the thing about the spawning female too, that people jack around with bass all the time, is the females will spawn in multiple nests bass wise. They spread their genetics all over the place for a couple of weeks. They're not dumb either. And literally, like bluegill spawning, when you've got just a bluegill bass pond, reproduction is not your problem. Like, I don't even really care do you have habitat? Some, a little. It almost doesn't even matter. You just about can't mess it up. Where you start messing it up is when you've got way too many bass per acre or not enough bass per acre. And I guess that's probably the easiest way to explain this. Like one of the very first ponds, like let's use just real life ponds, right? One of the very first ponds that I saw when I was at University of Georgia. And it was done intentionally this way. It was presented to us intentionally this way. Okay. The teacher, our professor, Dr. Gilbert, knew, each fish population, the bounds of each fish population, right, in advance, because he was teaching the class. We, of course, did not. And the first fish population that we went to was something that was really just completely mismanaged. It was stocked with bluegill, and that's it. There was no other fish put into the pond. It's about 3 acres, and it was just bluegill in the pond. So we had an electrofishing boat. We had a seine. We had all this fancy fish sampling equipment. We're all students with the university, and out we go to the pond, and the only thing we catch are 3-inch bluegill. Excuse me. So everybody, and like you said too, and it's so hard. Like, are you sure it's a bluegill? Are you sure all these are bluegill? Like, there's not any of these fish are some other different species of sunfish, not a bluegill. You know what I'm saying? That's very hard to determine, for anyone. I don't care who you are, because sunfish, bluegill can hybridize, so you can have, yeah. So anyway, we go out, and the first thing you noticed was like all the bluegill are like that 2 to 3 finger size, all poor looking, all had like a kind of a bigger eye than you would expect a fish that size to have. Okay. So here's what happens when this happens. You stock the forage base, which is the bluegill. There's no predators, which are the bass in a simple system, just bass bluegill system. There were no bass added. So the bluegill started doing their monthly spawning cycle like we just described, right? But there was nothing there to control those numbers. So each month, bluegill are born in, but there's nothing to control them. So zooplankton is a big part of their diet. 50% of their diet is zooplankton. The other 50% of their diet mostly is just aquatic insects, which is a very diverse food web of insects on the bottom of a pond. You can get a whole degree on that for 25,000 years. And the bluegill just it gets very competitive, because they're the only fish there. There's so much reproduction, and there's no predators, right? And so that was the exact situation that we were looking at. And one of the tips that just physically that we learned on that day, and I've used it since then, is that enlarged eye. That enlarged eye is an indicator of a stunted fish population, because the eye will keep growing even when the fish's body doesn't. And the head and the mouth, you know what I mean? Like, you've seen bass that look that way. especially on crappie and bluegill, it'll be their eyeball. And these fish just had these huge eyeballs for this little bitty fish, you know, and it was because they had been stunted for so many years.
Interesting. So that's a way of telling its age is like,
yeah, it's a tell.
Yeah,
you know, and it was. I wish back then. This is kind of going back to that. That was 1993, so there was no cell phones and stuff back then when I saw that pond, but it was really obvious. So crazy enough, that place sold, changed, switched around, and I actually ended up managing that 3-acre pond for about 10 years. Years later, after that, like almost 15 years later, I picked that pond back up and managed it. And even all those years later, nobody put any bass in it. Nobody fixed it. They left it in the cow pasture. They left it alone. So I fixed it. I brought some F1 bass there in, about 8-inch F1 bass into it. And
they had a ball.
Oh, dude, they had a party. And I had the guy, I was like, look, man, we got plenty of bluegill. I said, what the problem is going to be, because the numbers of bass we're about to stock in here, they might eat them all. We might have to stock some more forage. We'll bring some shad. We'll bring a bunch of stuff. Turn the feeders on. Buy a fish feeder. Turn that on. And dude, it worked out really well. That pond came around great. The bass were 7-8 pounds in 3 acres in no time. I actually had so many threadfin shad in that pond that I introduced hybrids in there. I had wipers in there. I had 50 wipers in there. And I got in trouble for doing that because he would take his daughters, who at the time were like 8, 10, you know, Snoopy Poland down around the fish feeder.
Dang near pull them in.
The wiper jacked the Snoopy pole out into the pond, completely detached the Snoopy pole. There was a lot of drama that day. I got a call. He's like, man, what did you put some kind of fish in here? I was like, yeah, man, you remember I said I had some stripers? He's like, yeah, we just lost a Snoopy pole.
You owe me $12 for a new
Hurt
Snoopy.
some feelings. But anyway, so we can totally mess up a pond and stunt the bluegill out at 3 inches, right? We can also go the other way, stock too many bass, and have a situation where we'll have small bluegill that are hatched out monthly. And how you can tell a bluegill is hatched monthly is his body will be clear. So if you use a seine net and you pull along the edges, that's one way we sample them. And you'll get them out. They'll be about the length of your smallest fingernail, like your pinky nail, about that long. They'll be clear through the body. So you know those clear bluegill about that size are going to be out like a month. Smaller than that, they'll be, 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, whatever, something like that. So if you understand how to look at it, and you pull your seine a little bit later in the year, around in the fall, especially after you've had a few spawns, you can actually count the sizes of the bluegill there. You can count the number of the bluegill spawns you got for the season.
So you've got like probably a 1 centimeter long clear bluegill that's about a month old. So that's interesting to me, because I would have assumed, if you'd have put a gun to my head before we started this, I would have told you a 1 month old bluegill was 2 inches long. I don't know, something like that. So the beginning is a slower growth than probably I thought.
And millions of them, millions, billions.
At that point, they're like a soft crawl, where like it's a crawl that's just, it's a little gelatinous snack for a bass or whatever, because it's so defenseless and it's so stupid and it's just sitting there and it's so juvenile. At what point do they start to get some defensive posture to them, or start to get their dorsals up? Or like, at what point are they not just a walking snack for a bass anymore, and they at least have some wherewithal and a little bit of defense to them?
Well, okay, how much time do we have?
Yeah. I got all night, my man.
That's a really complex question, okay? Because in a way, okay, so if in our 1 acre pond situation, we can easily overstock our bass. Like, the reason why I got my bass to grow in that little 2 acre pond to 4 pounds in 2 growing seasons was because of the density. I stocked 40 bass per acre. Okay. If I stocked twice as many bass, they would grow half as fast. I would probably not even have 2 pound bass right now. Right. Okay. So we have to understand that the bluegill are completely defenseless against the bass. Okay. If you don't stock the right number of bass, they're finished. Like they'll get crushed no matter how good the structure is, no matter what you do, right? They're done if you don't stock the bass population properly. Okay. So that's the first, and that's the really, for me, like the most important. If you can go in and get that idea across to a guy that you can kill it with over predators too, that's really important. But going back to the bluegill, okay, so a bluegill has a lateral line just like a bass, right? A bluegill is a sight feeder and it feeds on zooplankton, so it can feed on. It has excellent sight, right? And it has a lateral line system. So when you start combining hearing, which is all in with that lateral line in the head around the sight and all that together, it's all very complex. And it's also a very unique fish in that the way that its pectoral fins work, it can gain kind of bursts of speed in weird and unique ways because of his body shape. And it's not like a bass. It has agility in different ways, I guess, because of its, physically, it just moves differently, right? So if you think about a lateral line system as like radar, right? Because that's kind of what it is. And radar can see stuff in the air, and a fish's lateral line system can feel stuff in the water. Okay, well, it's usually like for bluegill, and that's the nice thing about bluegill too, is it's kind of like the lab rat of the fish world. They go everywhere. They're the best forage. Like for anybody who listens to this podcast in North America, bluegill are the best forage for your pond, right? Because of that fact, that's what makes them, any of the research that's done, it can be done almost anywhere because they survive and are hardy and do really good almost anywhere. That being said, the bluegill, and I'm looking at my notes now and trying to make sure that I go along and don't jump around. Hold on. Since they primarily, once they're born, going back to your point, they're kind of are a yolk sac with eyes, but they're eating zooplankton. Okay, so the density levels of your zooplankton is what controls the density levels of the bluegill that can even make it to an adult size. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Because I think sometimes we want this simple answer where it's like, bluegill grow an inch a month or something. And it's like, that's not just how all this stuff works. I'm guilty of that. I sit here and think, right, there's probably some standard answer to this, and there's not. It's like, how much zooplankton do you have? How big is the body of water you're in? What is the temperature all year long? What's their growth year look like? Because we were talking, I think even before we started, like my growth year up here is very different than your growth year down in Florida. Your growth year is all year long, where I've got, 6, 7, 8 good months around here maybe for these fish to grow. So yeah, that's an interesting point, and something probably to keep in mind too, is that it's all variable. And as much as we want a clean cut answer of how fast these fish grow, it just depends.
It really depends on where you are in the country. But like I said, the nice part about the bluegill is the research. There's a lot of research about them, because anybody who does fisheries research in North America could possibly do a research paper, and has, on bluegill. You know what I mean? So let's pull some of those ideas from there, right? So just our research papers that I can remember seeing that interested me, like some of the trivia was like, if we made the point, the lateral line is like radar, right? Well, twice the distance of the length of the bluegill. You got a 1-inch bluegill, right? His lateral line can feel maybe 2 inches away from him. Okay. You got an 8-inch bluegill. Well, now you've got something that's got incredible sensitivity 16 inches away from itself. Okay. You've got a completely different animal, and by sensitivity, what do we mean by sensitivity? Okay. And this has been researched, documented well in bluegill as well. Okay. So let's think about a lateral line. And like we said, is it we can see like radar. We can kind of get the idea. We see a mile away, there's a group of birds on radar. A lateral line kind of works the same way. The water gets displaced by something swimming through it, and the lateral line system can feel that displacement of the water. It can literally feel that water moving. A bluegill's lateral line is so sensitive that, think about it. If something goes by in the fog, you can still see that fog swirl, right? Same thing happens in the water when something goes by. For 5 minutes, a bluegill can feel that. In still water where you don't have a lot of, basically it's indefinite. You know what I'm saying? Like they can feel that, what is the word that I'm looking for? Hydrodynamic trails. If you move it through the water like that, right? Those kind of swirling things. And if you like, sometimes you'll see it in a swimming pool, like in a common swimming pool. If you move and you'll see those little rings, they'll go all the way across the swimming pool and they will never stop. You know what I'm talking about? Well, bluegill can feel that, right? So it can use that to track its prey in the water on a microscopic zooplankton level and feed in the dark on hydrodynamic trails like that. So you're talking about something that's so super sensitive. So when you're putting your lure down and the bluegill comes and looks at it, and then swims away, yeah, it's because it's like a sensitivity factory. Everything about it tells it that ain't food.
Dude, I have learned between what you just said and something that I went to a couple weeks ago, I've learned more about now bluegill too, but a bass and a bluegill's lateral line than I ever knew in my life. Like I've been told my whole life lateral line is just this magic sixth sense that a fish has where it's like when I throw my, jig 30 feet away from the bass over here and it falls, we're in muddy water, whatever, it feels it and it goes over there and it eats it. And it's like, that's not, I learned this a couple weeks ago and I went down to Houston, was talking to Mark Sexton, another guy that's a biology guy for Berkeley. And he was like, dude, they can feel like same thing, a length or two length of the fish from them,
about
and that's
two body lengths. Yeah,
they can't feel something 20 feet away, dude. They have no clue. That's not what it's for. No. It's for close proximity killing. And it's for, like, I'm sitting here, I'm a bass, I'm down in the rocks, there's a craw that's 8 inches away from my face somewhere, I don't know where he's at, and his antenna moves this much, and
you
bam.
Got him.
Yeah,
that's
just
it.
absolutely nails him. And he's like, it just triangulates it, and it's game over. And I never knew that. I thought it was for feeling things from far away, and that's how they tracked down prey in, like, big open water.
Well, some of your schooling fish will use lateral line to school.
Okay. That will make sense too. That's why they're able to move all in unison at a microseconds notice. They're not doing it by sight. They're not doing it by anything else. They're doing it by, they feel that water molecule move just like the other 2,000 fish felt that
and
water molecule move, and they all go. Yeah.
Now, the crazy thing is some schooling fish don't, which is like, dang, then how do they do it?
Which ones do you think don't use that or feel
which
that?
One? I'm trying to think which fish don't have lateral lines. I think it's mostly saltwater is where my mind is going with that. And again, as a fish biologist, you think I should be it's the way the internet treats me. All fish trivia should be entrapped right here. But there are a few fish that don't have lateral line systems.
All right, folks, we'll get back to our conversation with Shan in just a second. But first, we are brought to you in part by RTIC. RTIC coolers are my favorite coolers on the market for two specific reasons. One, they never let me down and they perform just how they're supposed to every single time. And two, they're half the price of the other guys. So you get the same or better quality at half the price. And to me, that's a win-win. And right now, they've got their Game Day Essentials sale going on over on the website where you can save 10% off halftime water coolers, 10% off 72-quart ultralight wheeled coolers, 20% off bottle chillers and can chillers, 10% off ultra tough coolers, and 40% off baskets and dividers. So whether you need a hard cooler for the boat, you need a soft cooler for the kayak, a new coffee mug for your morning commute, or an insulated tote for grocery trips, RTIC has you covered. So head over to www.rticoutdoors.com to check out their full sale that they have over there for the Game Day Essentials sale and save big on your favorite coolers and favorite drinkware. Again, that's www.rticoutdoors.com. Keep the adventure going with RTIC. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Shan O'Gorman. Okay, so the one thing when I talked to you before this was I had it in my mind that I was going to try and put together to be able to say like I do with shad. Like around here, we were talking in the green room before we started that around here, I've gotten pretty good at knowing what size my shad from that year's spawn are going to be in the fall, like a time of year where I'm really trying to mimic shad on our lakes and our ponds and our rivers and things like that. And I know that like 2.5 to 3 inch shad is just that sort of money size for that year's spawn of shad that I'm trying to imitate. But what I've learned over the past 10, 15 minutes talking to you is that you can't do that with gills. Like I'm not going to be able to say in November, I need to mimic a 3.25 inch bluegill, because even if I could get a standard growth rate for my area, they're spawning so much that you're not just getting 1 year's spawn, right? You're getting 4, 5, 6 months worth of different spawn cycles of these fish. So you are going to have variable sizes. That's why I can go out and I just ice fished last week and I caught 9-inch bluegill and I caught 2-inch bluegill.
Correct. Yeah, good observation. Yeah, absolutely. Now, what we can do though is we can derive, like, let's talk about just in general, a general healthy lake or a generally healthy fish population. If I went out and got an electrofishing survey or a net, or just went and caught bluegill, I would want to see bluegill in every size class, meaning 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 5 inch, 6 inch fish, right? So what happens when you get piled up with like a bunch of 1 pound bass? Say that's the biggest problem in our southern lakes, is we get a bunch of 1 pounders and the lakes get stunted. All the 1 pound bass have the same size mouth, so that 3 to 4 inch size class bluegill disappears. Okay. And that's what I was referring to before. You don't have an unlimited, even though bluegill are the best spawners and bluegill are great forage, and you can feed them and you can do all these things, you can still have a situation where they get overrun and your bass don't grow on them.
So you said you want to see 3, 4, 5, 6 inch fish as you're surveying this. Is there a size that you don't want to see? Like, is there a too big where you're like pulling up 11, 12 inch dinner plates and you're like, yeah, this isn't good?
Not really, no.
No, okay.
They're so infrequent that, and when you have those, I have this little saying that I used to use when I was on my electrofishing boat, and it's diversity of size wins the prize. And when I see 4 inch, 5 inch, 6 inch, 7, 8, 9, 10 bass, same thing with bluegill, same thing with shad, same thing with red ear and these and non-competing species of fish, the healthiest places. And again, that's why I bring it up, because bluegill is important that way. When you see a nice, diverse population of bluegill, that is a strong indicator of a healthy ecosystem.
Because that's the other thing, like as I try and mirror this to shad, it's like we've talked about this before on past episodes. There are lakes around here that have shad populations that are out of control, and you see 12, 13, 14 inch shad, and those are the same lakes that have stunted bass in them, and the shad populations got out of control and the bass can't keep up with them. I didn't know if you've ever seen that the same way in bluegill.
You can have that in bluegill, sure. Like in the example that we used at the beginning when we started talking, where the bass population, there was no bass population in all bluegill. Well, what happens is if you just put a few bass in there, they would have plenty to eat. They would grow exceptionally fat. They'd be fat and healthy and look stupid big. But when they spawned, bluegill would eat their eggs. The bass would never even be born because there's so many hungry bluegill. So it's a disruption in the food system that way. And they actually went at that level, they interrupt their own reproduction, eating their own eggs. When bluegill get to the point where they're that crowded, and then it becomes a cycle where they're kind of stuck in that crowded state. So what I did to fix that is I went in there with bass. I did about 25 bass per acre, I think, that were all like a pound. They were all big enough to already go in there and eat those fish. I didn't do any kind of fry in there at all. Every fish in there had a bass that could handle it. And they were F1 bass. So they were highly aggressive, highly predatory, and they went to work on that place and made quick work of those bluegill. It swung back around well. It was a good pond.
So as you observe bluegill at these places, what's the benchmark where like a bluegill is no longer considered like a juvenile?
The break point probably is 3 inches, because that's the point at which they can start laying eggs and become reproductive, is 3 inches.
A 3-inch bluegill is spawning
and can lay 10,000 eggs. What I told you, man, they can lay some eggs.
So how old do you think that 3-inch bluegill is?
Oh, not old. A year, most places probably, you're going to have that introductory period. Like I said, you'll get that kind of like that pinky nail size fish pretty quick here in Georgia and Florida. They'll be getting that size just within a few months. And then, you'll have, it's easier to show you in a seine, actually, when you scoop them out of the lake and you go, you see this size was born then, this size was born then. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. It's actually easier to see than it is to describe.
So in a world where, like that pond you were talking about at the beginning, where there's no predatory fish or bass at all, what do you think like the natural lifespan of a bluegill is that doesn't have to worry about a predator?
That would be a terrible condition to keep your fish in. That's like a starved condition. They're stunted and in very poor health condition. And what was happening there is what you'll see in all wildlife populations that aren't really managed properly. It's what's called a boom bust cycle, where there's a big population, there's nothing to control it. There gets to be so many of them that disease actually kills them. They die in mass. It becomes a smaller population. So while all those fish are dead in mass, their food resources come back a little bit. So when the new fish and that cycle kind of repeats itself, a boom bust cycle like that, right? We want to avoid that. So by adding the bass, it's like putting cows on a pasture and not having to mow it, right? We've got all those bluegill being born. All right, well, now let's put 35 or 40 bass per acre on top of that and let those bass mow off that and let those bass feed on that. And that's what pond management is.
Okay, so rephrase it a different way then. Like when you said something about you can see the growth rings on these fish, what's the oldest fish that you're seeing? Like what is the natural death time of a bluegill? Like in a perfect world, if I keep it in a cage or something, how long can a bluegill live?
Oh Lord, you can get them out. I'm sure, God, probably like 8 or 10 years. We had a green sunfish in an aquarium at school the entire time that I was there. And I think I was in college for about 16 years. So I'm not sure on that. Yeah, a long time, but they are forage, so, you know what I mean? And in one of those situations where there is a nice diverse population of all bluegill forage sizes, they're not long for the world. They don't. They are bait.
They're not made and put on this earth to live 10 years. They're made
not.
To get eaten.
They're absolutely not. And actually, I don't know if you can see, I have one of my fish scales that I do my bass. They also make them for bluegill. You have standard weights for bass. You have standard weights for bluegill, so you can track the relative health. It gives you. It's like a BMI chart for anybody who hasn't followed along. You had to go to the doctor and they say, okay, like I know I'm 6 feet tall and the chart says I should be like 185 pounds and I'm 207 pounds. So, I know I'm like, should lose a little bit of weight. The chart works the same way for the fish, just the opposite way. When the fish gets skinny, we know that there's kind of a problem. And that's a real important scale when you're managing ponds to understand, But you could go 3 hours on trying to explain that. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But
one rabbit hole I kind of do want to go down is color patterns, because I've seen it around here. Just again, this is anecdotal, I guess, but like I can think of 3 lakes that are probably within 25 to 30 minutes of my house, and those 3 lakes have very distinctly different looking bluegill. Like I've got a lake that's probably it's a bigger public lake, and those bluegill just seem to have a duller color to them, a duller pattern. And then you've got another smaller public lake where those fish are striped up like crazy, and they're super like the tiger stripes you get on the side that are just the really beautiful looking bluegill. And then we've got a lake where even I know you said like the spawning patterns will get purple, but like almost every bluegill that I see in this has some sort of purple to blue like tint to it. And it's just, and that's a very dirty lake. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it either, but I'm sure there are a lot of variables in that, but what determines the different look of bluegill at different bodies of water? Like, is it genetics? Is it diets? Is it habitat? What do you think is like the main reason why I can tell and look at a picture and go, that's probably a bluegill from this lake and that's a bluegill from this lake?
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, and you're paying very close attention to notice shifts like that. Okay. So one of the things that you'll see shifts like that is the lake. The first thing that jumps out at me on color patterns on fish is the color of the water. Are you dealing with stained water? Or are you dealing with clear water? Okay. Because as water colors shift, either due to rain stain in the water, construction stain in the water, or the opposite, like plants clearing the water, causing, months or weeks of extremely clear water, fish's bodies can react to that and change their colors to match the environment. So a fish that would show all those elaborate stripes and crazy colors when the water's clear might just look like a silver dollar when the water's stained. And that's nothing to do but just about its body changing, just actually shifting to it, kind of it's the best color for that fish to be in that environment. So you have to remember, fish can shift their color in that environment. They don't stay consistently the same colors. But that being said, I know exactly what you mean on the fish being completely different looking, and consider too diet, and also can be bluegill can be omnivores in that they will eat some plant material when it's available, and the species dependent on the species of the plant. So you'll see a significant difference in color on bluegill from ponds and lakes that have the option to eat some plants versus the ones that don't. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, that would make sense too, because these three different lakes I'm thinking of, the ones that are real striped up, it's the clearest water by far. Like, of
with the most
three.
plants.
Yeah, those are the ones that are the cleanest looking and the prettiest looking. Ironically, the dirtiest lake of the three is the one where they have that sort of off purple hue to them. And that's just like, it is a mud hole lake almost all year long. Like, even when you get perfect conditions, you haven't had rain for a month and a half, that lake probably
still stays
has
dingy.
Oh yeah, it's probably got 3 inches of visibility, like 4 inches of visibility.
Right.
Very,
and you
very
should
dirty
see
lake.
the fish in that lake stay consistent colors too. You won't see them change very much.
Nope, they're always the same. Same with the bass. The bass in that lake are ugly, pale bass. Yeah.
Again, I was about to say, that doesn't mean the fish can't be big and healthy in a lake like that.
It's probably one of the healthiest lakes around here that no one knows about, and no one fishes it because it's gross.
Right. Yeah. No, there's bass in Georgia. They're certainly that way. They say that Georgia red clay stain, and it just takes two breaths of wind to kick up that powder that stains it, that causes it to stay muddy like that forever. But you can catch nice bass in them.
So are there different patterns that you're going to see at different times of year? Like, are you going to see, I know obviously like spawning, you're going to have some different colors there, but what should we look for? Like, is there a difference between a cold bluegill and a midsummer bluegill?
You know what I think pay attention to, just like we talked about, the variability of the color patterns literally can be across the street. Like, you can be this lake and then literally just go across the street to a lake across the street and be a completely different looking fish. So keep some fish. Don't be afraid to take some crickets with you from time to time. Pay attention to the color patterns of the fish in the lakes where you're fishing. I think that's probably the best general way that everybody can take something away from this, is pay attention to the color of the forage.
That's a good point, too. I've done that before with craws, and I should probably do that with bluegills, too. I went out, this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but when I was really getting into stuff, and I was like, I'm going to try and figure all this stuff out, I went out and I collected craws from under the same bridge of a river, different times of year. And then I took pictures of them, of what they looked like at different times of year. And then I used that to like pick my jig colors and stuff back when I was like trying to learn a bunch of stuff. That's probably an interesting thing maybe to do for the bluegill in your local lake or your pond or something too. Just like, like you said, go out there, bring some power bait or something, catch one or two of them, take pictures of them, and then keep a log, and then look back over the course of a year and then see if there's any patterns you can pick out.
Well, I would do this too, even. I mean, I can, because I'll just tell you how the patterns that I use, that any kind of shift towards stain, right? That stained chocolate, whatever kind of stained water pattern you want to shift to. And it could even be shifted heavily towards stained with like a dense plankton bloom, like dense green, where you can't see even that stain. I'll go to something like a rattle trap, solid silver, something with some thump, something with some sound, something, because as soon as the water gets stained, you need to start triggering on the ears and on the lateral line, and because the eyes aren't there anymore. You know
what's funny you mentioned? So you mentioned like throwing a silver rattle trap, which I think a lot of people are going to listen and think, well, that's a shad pattern. It's like, no, think about like the bluegill that I was just talking about in one of my lakes that are the palest,
they look just like silver rattle traps.
Yeah. Shad pattern baits look more like those bluegill than bluegill pattern baits do.
No, a trap is a great shad pattern, or a great bluegill pattern. Yeah, absolutely. And especially when you learn to yo-yo it the right way. The yo-yo trap in the muddy water is death, man. You can get on some good days.
And you have variable depth. Like, I think that's sometimes the hard part with, when people want to throw a certain thing, but you talked about it, right? You caught a fish in 45 foot of water in a bluegill down there.
You know what I'm saying?
You can fish that rattle trap in 45 foot of water if you want.
Spread it around. I don't, that's what we were just talking about this I was on another podcast with a guy, and I was talking about this. Like, I don't teach people how to fish. Right. I can't do that. Like, I don't like, can't show you how to rig the worm. I can't tell you how to drag the jig. I definitely can't tell you how to win a bass tournament, but I can talk to you about pond management and relate it to biology so that you can take it to the lake. And that does make you a better fisherman. You know what I mean? It's in understanding all these things, and they're really complex and they're hard to explain. That's the thing. You have to have long format.
Well, and we're trying to learn things that it takes people like you years and years and years of, college and higher education to learn. And we're trying to not only do it in an hour or an hour and 10 minutes or whatever, but we're also trying to do it in terms that people like me can understand that haven't gone through those classes and know the terminology. And like, I know that that's a tough part. Some people, I'm going to pump you up for a second here, because this is one of my favorite things about you, is I've talked to people before that are in like the aquatic biology type field, or they're doing research papers or something, and they can't turn off the biologist speak to talk to guys like me. They can't do it because they spend their whole day in a lab somewhere talking to people that know the words that they know. And I've had phone calls with people before where I thought I was going to do an episode with them, and you'll have like a phone call to kind of feel it out. And you'll just learn really quickly. You're like, man, this just isn't going to work.
I can't put people to sleep like this.
Well, yeah, it's like, I don't even understand what we're talking about here. Like, I don't get it. And I'm pretty immersed in this stuff. I was like, the guy that's driving to work right now, that goes to the lake twice a month, like, we're not going to understand what you're talking about. And there's just dudes and girls too I've talked to that just can't shut off the biologist speak. But you do a really good job of doing that and putting it in like terms that regular Joes like me can understand.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do, man. And I can promise you, though, that did not come from college. If you would have taken me out of the university now, and that's where I learned, too, very quickly, because I was a consultant. I did work with private landowners and lake owners, homeowners associations, apartment complex guys, private lakes, all that kind of stuff. That I was good. I got a great education, and I was very good pond manager. I was very good at, being a field biologist. But being good at being a field biologist, being a pond manager, doesn't make you articulate at being a field biologist or articulate at explaining science. So I came by this because my business, if you owned a pond at your house and we were consulting together, you'd be sending me pictures. I caught this, I did this, right? And I would be explaining to you, okay, well, this is what's going on, right? And I'd be walking you through that kind of stuff. And I have conversation after 30 years, after conversation with guys who don't have that vocabulary. That's how I got here. Talking to just regular guys with ponds. Yeah. Guys who are like, hey, man, I need this pond to fish good. And I'm like, yeah, I need your pond to fish good, too, because I want to keep managing ponds for a living.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to get paid.
So, yeah, we both have vested interest in this. But, yeah, that's exactly how I got here, was talking to everyone but scientists. Those dudes are boring, man.
Well, and I can tell you, me and thousands of people that are listening to this appreciate that, because I can't sit here and listen to the molecular genetic zooplankton, mahoogadiggy thing here that was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Small words, 2 syllables max, please.
I'm with you on that, man. And I can promise you that I tell the kids too that come through, because I get a ton of them with getting some nice engagement on all the platforms now. Thank you, everyone who follows, by the way. But I tell the kids, it's like, okay, I'm just letting you know, I understand this is cool and you want to like study and stuff, but I have gone through and picked the interesting stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not all going to be fun. Yeah.
This is all of it. There's nothing left for you to learn that's any fun over there. Yeah. Good luck. Have fun. It's torture.
Well, we appreciate your sacrifice going through those classes, so we didn't have to. All right, folks, we'll get back to our conversation with Shan in just a second, but first, we are brought to you in part by Dakota Lithium Batteries. And whether you have an $80,000 boat or a $2,000 boat, whether you get a $99 kayak or a $5,000 kayak, you got $70 worth of electronics or $5,000 worth of electronics, make sure that they're being powered by the best. And for me, the best batteries in the game right now are Dakota Lithium Batteries. Dakota Lithium Batteries are twice the power of traditional batteries at half the weight. They charge up to 5 times faster. They last up to 4 times longer. They have completely US-based customer support, and they come with a whopping 11-year warranty standard. So you can run the best batteries in the business with over a decade of warranty protection to make sure that your time on the water is never cut short. But right now, we're not only going to save you battery weight, we're not only going to save you headaches from the other underperforming batteries, we're also going to save you money, because you can go over to www.dakotalithium.com and you can use code TACKLETALK10 for 10% off your entire purchase just for listening to the show. We recommend products we like, we work with brands we love, but we're always trying to save you money. So we're going to do that on your next battery with code TACKLETALK10, 10% off your battery over at www.dakotalithium.com, the official lithium battery of Bassmaster. All right, let's get back to our conversation with Shan O'Gorman. Hey, before we let you go, I have an idea that someone else suggested, and I think I want to do it because I've piled up probably 4 or 5 questions that have come through to our mailbag over the past probably couple months. And they're questions that I saved because I think you are much more qualified to answer these questions than I am. So we have a couple questions from the mailbag powered by Dakota Lithium.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast Mailbag, powered by Dakota Lithium Batteries. Adventure awaits at dakotalithim.com.
The first question that I have here is from Jennifer, and she says, and this is from about a month ago, and she says, do you think bass know the difference between a regular bluegill and something like a red ear or a green sunfish? And if so, do you think they prefer one over the other?
Good question, Jennifer. I think it'll matter very little if we're talking, say, all 3 are, we're talking, say, a 4-pound big largemouth bass, and all 3 forage size, nothing too big for it to eat or anything. The color patterns on all 3 of those don't matter. If you're trying to mimic them. But I don't think it's going to matter much to the bass. The bass kind of knows those types of fish have spiny, like dorsal fins. There's kind of a built-in strategy, especially for the larger bluegill. Since we're on the topic of bluegill, those big dorsal spikes are protection from being swallowed, and sometimes that helps. Sometimes you see them wedged and both dead. Those types of scenarios. But I've also seen, though, where you have in a pond, say 15 to 30 acres, well-maintained, well-managed, and where there's diversity of things, say like rainbow trout being stocked as supplemental forage, and along with a pond full of bluegill where the trout are lethargic in the springtime and the trout are also a larger meal and also don't have spines and things. And you watch meals that are easier be consumed at a higher rate than bluegill. Does that make sense?
Yep. Like the trout are one of the words I get made fun of, but I use on this show quite a bit is slurpable. Yes. They're a lot more slurpable than bluegill is because they're less defensive. Like you said, you're not going to have to deal with the pokey, spiny stuff. They just kind of slide right down and they're a great little snack and then you keep going on. That's why those fish like out in California were getting so big when the state of California was stocking all those trout in those big, deep, clear lakes.
Right. But at the end of the day, if you're getting bass growth, the bass have to have a massive amount of protein to grow. They have to have 10 pounds to grow 1 pound, and that's each bass. And that's the problem you have in a pond is if you get too many bass, you don't have enough forage for each of those bass to get 10 pounds. So that's where our harvesting, you have to understand how to keep some bass out to keep your bass population growing on bluegill. And that's what's going to be interesting going forward with the pond. We're going into year 3 on the pond I've recently stocked here. And we'll be getting real good growth. We should have bass going past 6 pounds and just stupid football fish, just ridiculous, huge.
Yeah. How long is that 6 pound bass you're going for?
Let's see. It will probably be, let's pull our tape measure out here. On my chart here, you see the 17 and the standard weight is 2.7. We've had 2 17-inch fish at 4 and 4.1.
Dang footballs.
Yeah. So
like
if we get a couple more inches of growth out here to around that, where a standard weight is 4 pounds. Yeah, we're going to be pushing 6.
A 19-inch 6 pound bass is bonkers to think about.
A big, heavy, healthy, chunky fish. And that's what I'm talking about. We're talking about a fish that was stocked and never had one day of its life, not 1 minute of its life where it wasn't like, hey, look, something to eat. Bam, let's eat the entire time. Right.
It's lived in a golden corral its whole life.
But of nothing but bluegill. It's a simple 2.5 acre pond, and I'm getting world-class bass growth with a bluegill system and a feeder that consistently feeds the bluegill during the warm part of the year. We consistently feed them every day, what they'll eat in about 15 or 20 minutes. We track it live every day for anybody who wants to follow along, or every week or so for everybody who wants to follow along on any of the social medias. But it's really fun, that part of it. And I think it's great information because it proves to people you can grow a 4 pound bass in 2 years on bluegill. Right? It's a fact. You just witnessed a fact, right? And to say that fact to someone, it kind of goes in 1 year, but when they watch it live on Instagram, that's making a big difference. And I'm really proud about everything on social media, making those because people, when you show it to people that way, it really does make a difference. And we can have smarter conversations about fisheries management going forward when people understand the facts.
Yep. It's the days of, the small percentage of people that would read a scholarly article being the only ones that knew this now are in the past. Because like you said, you can put up a YouTube short and you can now have 600,000 people see that with their own 2 eyes. Like, oh yeah, this pond was drained 3 years ago and now I have a 4.2 pound fish in 18 months on bluegill alone.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because I did that happened to me exactly, except it was 800,000, not 6. Yeah. So it's entirely possible. And I think what's best about just pond biology and pond management and small impoundment management is that we can manage those systems and get results in a fairly short period of time, a year or 2, maybe even 3, but in a period of time that social media can track and watch and begin to understand, where when you start talking about managing a river or the Great Lakes or the ocean or things like that, those are, that's a different beast altogether.
Yeah,
But
it's way more
ponds and
digestible
small
when I can
lakes
think
are-
of a couple acre pond.
Yeah, they're totally manageable. And if you come across one day and you decide, hey, you know what, I'm going to drain it and restock it. Boom, you've got content. And every single one is different. They're all similar in ways, but they're also different. They're on their own little environments in ways. Different things happen at every one of them. And I mean, that's what drives the content on the page right there, is just talking about ponds.
All right, next question I've got is from Parker, and I think it's a he, says, do panfish like crappie and bluegill make noise?
Well, one fish that I'm certain makes noise, and it'd be one of the fish that we do have in the pond, a red ear or a shell cracker. And we put those in with the bluegill because they're very special. They only spawn once. They're not like bluegill where they spawn a lot, but they spawn early. So you get a nice early forage pop from a red ear population. But they also they have special teeth in the, like wisdom teeth, pharyngeal teeth, what they're called. They can crack open freshwater mussels, and they can eat those snails and mussels out. They can root the bottom, and that's what they primarily feed on. So that's really beneficial to our pond because those mussels and snails are host to most of the parasites that our fish can get, the little red sores and gill maggots and gilly whatever bad things. Those animals host most of that. So by adding the red ear, you reduce the snail population, which reduces the parasite population in the pond in general, but also those red ear or shellcracker, whatever you want to call them, are extracting protein out of the ground in the form of snails and mussels that no other fish can convert into protein that bass can now eat.
So you've unlocked another source that the bluegill weren't going to even be able to harvest from your pond. It would have just sat there and died.
Right. If you just had bluegill alone, you would have more parasites and not as much forage for your bass population.
Does that change I remember back to like one of our first episodes when we were talking about biomass. So
right.
Does having something like a red ear in there that's able to take protein from a source that wasn't even in the ecosystem for that bass to start, does that increase the biomass of that pond at all?
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. So it depends on how the biomass, what you're talking about, but like you've got like a certain percentage of weight in those snails, right? So the weight of those snails, if they're not being converted into shellcracker, which are being consumed by bass, is just being wasted. So you would have a reduction in the total number of bass just because you don't have that fish population there. So those shellcracker are important in a couple of different ways to our pond ecosystem, and they don't interfere with bass reproduction. They're not in there like raiding bass nests or anything either. You know what I mean? They're not raiding bluegill nests either. So that's a fish that fits into our system, right? But you got to think about that fish. What does it do? It looks like a little league baseball player spitting sunflower seeds when it feeds. It cracks snails open all day long and spits out shells. You'll see the shells all over the bottom, right? That's shellcracker spitting them out. So you can bet your butt you can hear those things getting cracked open. That would definitely be one of those fish that would make noise underwater.
Interesting. And yeah, that's probably a calling card for, if bass are trying to eat them too. Because, think of how far sound travels underwater. It's a lot. I always tell people, the example of, when you were a kid and all you had to do was drop a penny on one side of the pool and you can freaking hear it on the other side of the pool if you're underwater.
Right.
Sound travels so fast. So if you've got some, bluegill munching on snails down there, like a shellcracker, those fish are going to be able to zero in on that pretty quick.
Absolutely.
All right, last question here I got for you is from Aaron, and he says, I always see bluegill near the bank at one of the lakes by my house. Are they the same bluegill every time, or do bluegill move around the lake a lot, and I'm just seeing different fish in the same spot?
That's a good question, too. I would say that they're probably the same bluegill every time, but also be aware that they are forage fish and short-lived. So year after year after year, No, those are not the same fish. But from day to day, yeah, probably so. They're not really the type of migratory fish that's going to go take off across the lake. Now, of course, you will see them change that pattern when you have feeders. Like when the automatic feeder starts going off on a pond every day, a couple of minutes before it goes off, it's like, where are all the fish going? Why are all the fish swimming that way? So, they can be trained too.
So you see that? You see, like, if you've got your automatic feeders on a timer, those fish have an internal clock good enough to move over there right before it's going to go off?
Oh, yeah.
That's insane.
Literally, like, every single fish in the pond is, like, sitting there waiting on it like it's like at the cafeteria. And not only that, the bass figure out, and it's usually the smaller the pond, the more you can witness this. Like, the ones that are, like, 1 to 2 acre ponds. All the fish in the pond just clear out. It's like, here they all come because they know the feeder's about to go off. And then the bass just sit there and wait, because as soon as the pellets start hitting the water and the fish start feeding the pellets, they're not paying attention to the bass, and the bass just start waylaying them. So it's this whole kind of thing going on there that it's just, yeah, it's crazy.
So those bluegill that you're training on pellets, if you were to take the pellets away after like a year or two, do they just completely go back to normal and they find their own, food and forage on their own, or are they now helpless and they're just
that would be
dependent?
Terrible. That would be terrible. Because when I talk about, that's a great question, because especially as we're wrapping this up, if you stock a new pond, you don't have to feed it like this. You can stock the proper balance. You can get good fishing. You can get great bass growth, like I'm talking about, and not feed it. But this particular job, the guy's going for, we wanted to grow bass as fast as possible. So feeding is necessary for his requirements, but you don't have to feed it. So what would happen? This is the difference. I'll give you Georgia numbers because I know them the best. So in Georgia, if you stock that pond, you just leave it alone, you'll have about 100 pounds of fish per acre on average, right? With the feeder, you'll have about 350 pounds of fish per acre. So 3.5, sometimes even 4 times, depending on how hard you feed, 4 times the biomass in the pond. You can't turn that off and expect good things to happen. You know what I'm saying? That is it is a massive boost to the pond. So when your feeding program starts, everybody needs to be aware, okay, it needs to continue. And if it stops, it's never good. Like, it usually goes straight to like extremely bass heavy and extremely poor fish extremely fast.
So when you start this regimen of I'm going to do feeder on a pond, it's basically like you got to keep that up forever.
Yes.
And if you were going to try and wean them off of something, then you would have to start harvesting fish like crazy to get those numbers back down to something that pond could support naturally, right?
I've seen it happen all the time. People die, or the pond gets sold and the program stops, and Mother Nature takes care of itself. You don't go out and see this massive fish die off or anything usually. But where you'll see it is like in the relative weights of the fish and the general health of the fish and kind of how well the fishery fishes. And like, I don't know, it's, again, we could go on for several hours about all the like tips and things you can see, but you'll see it in the fish. It's like, these fish do not look right. It does not look good. Something's way wrong. And it was because it's literally like, you have a 4 acre, or you have 10 acres worth of fish in 2 acres of water.
Yeah. It's not sustainable unless you're pumping in an external food source.
No, it's not good. It just doesn't work. So if you're not going to consistently feed your fish, absolutely do not feed your fish. And it doesn't mean if you're not feeding your fish, it doesn't mean you can't have a perfectly healthy, good sport fishing population.
Well, hey, man, I appreciate you hopping back on. Thank you so much. I mean, I know you're a busy dude. I know you have a lot going on. You're one of everybody who listens to this show's favorite guest from day one. You've been an OG guest here on the show. And
how many years has it been now, man?
Dude, it's been, I think we're on year 5, something like that. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like 20 years. It also feels like it kind of just started yesterday. So, but yeah. It's definitely fun, but dude, I wish I had $1 for every time that I get a little message, wake up in the morning, getting ready to go to work, and I've got 4 messages that all say, when's Shan coming back on? So, yeah.
Well, maybe you will. Split them with me if you get any, all right?
Yeah. You're going to make a lot of people real happy with this one. But I wanted to let you know, before we let you go, I know there's been a lot of changes, obviously, with the content that you've been putting out since the last time you've been on the show, too. So I know the YouTube thing is going really well, and you're putting out a lot more than just, obviously, you still have the Instagram, you still have the posts and, more of the text that people can read, but now there's a lot more video out there. So can you tell folks what you've been up to and where folks can kind of keep up with you and kind of consume what you're doing?
Yeah, I made a big push towards YouTube. When I first got doing this, I'm 50 years old, so I did not grow up in the land of computers. I grew up with an Atari 2600. That was what I was rocking, and all this stuff I'm behind in, and would love nothing more in my YouTube journey right now to have an editor to edit these videos, because YouTube is a different land than some of these other social media platforms. I've done better on some of the other social media platforms than I had on YouTube, but I have kind of jumped into that the last 3 or 4 months and really made an effort on YouTube and gained some ground, and it's doing real well over there, and I think, now that I'm up to speed on what everything is, YouTube is a better place for what I'm doing. It's an easier place to scroll back and look at old videos, with the live features and things, and the short format video. It's all pretty much the same as far as that as social media goes, but just as far as being, what's the search engine, I guess, organized. It's an easier place for me to talk to people about what's going on. And so I'm just really pushing YouTube harder. And plus, it's actually the best play. I had no idea how much money those guys make over there. You do pretty good on YouTube, man.
Oh, yeah.
So
the guys that got it figured out and been doing it for a couple of years are doing pretty well. But like you said, it's a whole different beast in terms of the work that you have to do to put in. And you're doing these videos that are 30, 60 seconds long that people can consume, that aren't, 3.5 hours that people have to sit there and, listen through the information. You got a lot of really good short form stuff over there too, that people can go and look at and scroll through your YouTube shorts and everything, where you can explain something that might take someone else 15 minutes to talk about. You can get the point across pretty quick in those YouTube shorts. So
I'm glad you noticed that. I appreciate that, man. Well, that's interesting, because what I'm doing is I'm kind of just playing towards, my strengths, because I've been just doing short format video on Instagram for a long time. So I'm kind of seeing how it's different on YouTube, but still, a bulk of the people that are coming through on that are short format, are coming from the shorts, right? So my impression, and of course I'm kind of mimicking, using myself as a gauge. Like, if I'm watching shorts and I see somebody, oh, that's interesting, let me go look at his page, and the first video is 2 hours and 45 minutes. I'm not watching that. You know what I mean? So, but you come to my page and it's like 1:45, 2 minutes and 31, 3 minutes and 30, 1:01. You know what I mean? Digestible format. And I think because of kind of the short attention span theater we're living in right now, that's kind of helping me. But I certainly I will be doing and do longer format stuff, but I tend to do my long format stuff just live.
Well, and that's the thing I think we've seen is it's so weird, but audio, I think people want long form. Like, they want to have something they can turn on in the background, like they're listening to this right now, and most people are probably driving to work or driving to the lake or working out or doing dishes or whatever, and it's just on in the background. They're not sitting at a screen watching the, play button go like this for the next hour while they're doing it. It's just on in the background. So they like long form audio, but short form video seems to be the way that people are going nowadays. If I'm going to watch something, I want to be able to get the point across really quick and then move on and go to the next thing. If I'm listening to a podcast, then I'm fine with it being 30, 60 minutes, something like that. I think it's just the world we live in.
I agree. I really do. And I'm very inexperienced at YouTube, but just went past 6,000 subs over there. and a lot in the last 3 months. They all kind of piled in at one time. So if anybody's out there, trying to, break through and get those, keep at it, man. It's weird. I don't understand what makes the algorithm, the audience, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what it is that triggers. You see all those videos about how to edit your video to get all these, and I've done that, and some of my videos do get a lot more views because of that. But then the one that gets like 800,000 is just me running my yap at the phone. It's all over the place. It looks like I'm half drunk.
Yep.
There's no video quality to it whatsoever. I think if I can give anybody any advice, is just keep firing. Just keep putting it out there. It's all good. None of us are that picky. And as long as you've got, be positive and have good engagement skills, you're going to be fine.
Well, folks, go over to YouTube, go over to Instagram, Facebook, at Aquatic Biologist on all of them. You'll find him. That is our conversation with our good buddy, Mr. Shan O'Gorman. Shan, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for having me on again.
All right, everybody. That was our conversation with Shan. Shan, we appreciate you coming back on the show. We appreciate your time. We know he's a busy dude. Go follow him on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube to keep up with all the information that he's consistently putting out day in and day out. And a quick reminder to all of you that are in the Ohio area, we are rapidly approaching the Columbus Fishing Expo, February 9th through 11th in Columbus, Ohio. So I will be there all 3 days. I have a booth for Tackle Talk. You can find it in like the second or third aisle on your right when you walk in the main entrance. Come over and hang out. I'll have a ton of stuff for sale. I have hats, tumblers, we've got decals, including some new jumbo 5-inch circle decals that you guys have asked for. You've said that you wanted bigger decals for boats and stuff, so I got you covered there. We have kids' beanies. I have lures from Jig Masters. I'll be recording some spots for the show, as always, and we might have some trivia for you to take part in and win some prizes. It's always a fun time. I love meeting you guys and getting the chance to talk a little fishing. Again, it's February 9th through 11th in Columbus, Ohio. For more information, you can visit www.nationalfishingexpos.com, then click Expos at the top, I think, and then click Columbus. But as always, thank you guys so much for listening. I appreciate y'all a ton. Go visit our website, tackletalkpodcast.com, to submit a mailbag question. Shoot us an email, tackletalkpodcast@gmail.com. Find us on social media at Tackle Talk Podcast, and we will see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.
Thank you for listening to the Tackle Talk Podcast. Tackle Talk is produced by Andrew Hayes. Copyright 2021. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.